This Christmas saw a double anniversary here on BBC Radio 4. At 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, a lone chorister stepped forward to sing to the world, exactly 90 years since King's College in Cambridge held its first Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols, and also 80 years since the BBC made its inaugural broadcast of the event. For Radio 4, ex-choir member Brian Kay now explores the allure and the mystery of Christmas past and Christmas present at King's.
There's a very audible silence.
3 beats, 4 beats, and if you've been around the broadcast, you know that a boy has been selected by the director of music to sing the first stanza.
And you can almost feel these 1,200 people united as one person, just hoping it will go all right.
And then in this great cathedral-like acoustic, this voice rings out.
I mean, there's a tear in my eye, too. I mean, it's intensely moving moment. You know, all of a sudden one's back there, going up to the organ loft in the middle of the night in this dark chapel to practice. It all comes flooding back.
It is the innocence, it is the purity, it is the expectation. And then it's surrounded by the choral voices and then by the congregation.
And really, that is a metaphor for life. We all begin as a single voice and then become a community.
It really is an experience to last a lifetime. Nobody lucky enough to sit in King's Chapel on Christmas Eve could ever forget the magic. And here in the chapel's giant shadow on a rather wintry afternoon, my own thoughts race back about 45 years to the first time that I ever sang as a bass in the choir here. Bursting with excitement, I must say a little nervous, but with bags of pride. Ever since then, I've tried to work out exactly what is the magic of the occasion, the genius of those carols carefully chosen to reflect the words of the 9 lessons, the wonderful words themselves following the Christmas story from the very start. You know, year after year, people queue outside, very often in the freezing cold, in order to hear that story time and time again. People like Natalia Bird.
I think it's a transforming experience. It's something that begins with Genesis, and a chorister always reads that first lesson.
God tells sinful Adam that he has lost the life of paradise and that his seed will bruise the serpent's head.
And my memory is one of a particular boy whose father had not yet been dead a year. And I sat there, I think I was sitting on the north side, almost opposite the lectern, and heard this incredible reading of expression of this Genesis.
Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked.
And so many things are going through your mind. You're concentrating on the singing and the music, and you're with the boys, because we see the boys so many times during the week, and the men as well, and we know a lot of them and their parents. So I think it's very personal in that respect, for me, but also for them.
Ian Damascene sang in the choir in the 70s. I wonder what matters more to him, the words or the music?
It's the words. You're all together and you're all quite excited, and then he says, just for a moment, let's remember those on another shore and in a greater light. And it's what he hasn't said that means so. It's so profound, those other people who can't be there with you.
But upon another shore and in a greater light, that multitude which none can number, whose hope was in the Word made flesh.
The service would not be the same if it took place anywhere else other than this wonderful chapel here at King's College. And the building is so well known to millions all over the world who visit it and who experience it through radio and television. But not many people get behind the scenes to the little side chapels, of which there are many, including one here in the southeast corner, which was dedicated to the memory of all those kingsmen who lost their lives in the Great War. Fellows, scholars and choristers, all their names are here on the walls of the chapel, which was designed and instigated by Dean Milner White, who was responsible for bringing this great service of 9 lessons and carols to kings. The current dean here is Ian Thompson.
Milner White was an undergraduate at King's, and he, following ordination in 1908, he returns to the college as the chaplain, goes off in 1914 to the war, and comes back in 1918 after seeing war service on the Western Front in Italy, awarded the DSO in 1917. He comes back as the dean and a fellow. And he feels that what he has to do is find ways of connecting with people through liturgy that he, in his war services, felt the church is not doing. And he takes a hold of a service of carols and readings that had been developed by Archbishop Benson when he was Bishop of Truro at the suggestion of his successor, Walpole. And in Milner White's own words, in fact, at the beginning of the 1918 Order of Service for 9 lessons and carols here at King's, Milner White says this service was drawn up from sources ancient and modern by Archbishop Benson for cathedral use.
So it was the war experience that shaped his views on liturgy for this specific occasion.
Yes, and I think that what he does is he sees in Benson's model of a Christmas Eve carol service something he can adapt in this context.
Conflict runs right down the spine of this Christmas festival. During the years of the Second World War, the carol service here at King's carried on as normal, but the BBC was careful to avoid saying precisely where it was coming from. Not that I think anyone was fooled by that. And in the propaganda of the time, King's became a symbol for resistance.
Today, England stands unbeaten, unconquered, unafraid. On Christmas Eve, England does what England has done for 1,000 years. She worships the Prince of Peace.
My name's Michael Keel, and I joined the King's Choir in 1941 and sang through the rest of the war and left in December 1945. When I arrived in the beginning of the war, they were taking the windows out of the chapel.
Piece by piece?
Piece by piece, and storing them, we were always told, in a slate quarry in North Wales. But they filled in the chapel, for the lower section, they filled plain glass, in 4 positions, and there was a curtain that was pulled to
We're talking about 14th century Flemish glass. Absolutely. Of the best quality in the world.
Yes. The only windows that were left in were the west window, which is Victorian, and one other window up in the sanctuary. Everything else was taken out. And was replaced with batons of wood to which were attached tarpaulin. And when the wind got up, went right the way down the chapel. It was quite extraordinary.
But it must have been terrifically cold.
Very, very cold.
The wind from Siberia.
It was very cold, and my memory is that many of us suffered from awful chilblains.
I bet. Did the candles blow out?
They certainly waved around a great deal more than they do at the moment.
Because all you had was candles in those days.
That's right.
But you were young.
Yes.
You survived.
We survived, yes. I'm proud of it.
the sound of the choir at King's in 1945. The organist at the time was Harold Dark, famous not least for composing what's certainly for me one of the loveliest of all Christmas carols. Once the conflict was over, things got back to normal at King's, including the return of a director of music who'd been drafted on active service. MP and former choir member Michael Mates still remembers his feelings when he first joined the choir back in the 1950s.
To start with, it was a bit intimidating and daunting. Boris Ord, who'd been the organist and choir master at that stage already for about 20 or 30 years, was quite a tyrant, a benevolent one, I suppose. He had a twinkle. But he didn't have time because of the stretch for him of getting us ready within 2 months.
Your point is that he had a new choir every October.
Every October, 1/3 of his choir changed, because we were on a 3-year cycle, the 12 choral scholars. The boys were roughly the same, they were probably there 4 years. But yes, every time it was a new challenge for him. And it had to be done within 2 months. He didn't have a year. So the first term was pretty crowded and stressful. And we were starting some new carols, which had never been performed before, because in that stage a lot of new ones were coming up. So you'd be singing some Victorian church music, then all of a sudden, with the last 10 minutes of practice, you'd get this piece of paper with a highly modern carol. I remember A New Work Is Come on Hand, which was a new work, and we did its first performance. And Boris said, this is impossible, so we're going to do it every day. And so we did. But those sort of challenges were terrific fun.
I've moved under the dark wooden organ loft with the pipes above me, the angels blowing their golden trumpets right up there to the magnificence of the fan-vaulted roof. It's a rather special place because this is where the choir in my time used to assemble at the beginning of the service. Extraordinary moment, because once we were here, there was absolutely no turning back. Of course, if you're broadcasting to the world, it does bring a special kind of pressure. I can well remember my own feelings at that moment, but I used to wonder what it must have been like for the younger boy choristers preparing themselves to sing to the world. Michael Keel can still picture it way back in the 1940s.
Well, we were intrigued because the person who was producing the service stood on a chair and flashed a torch from quite a long way away. That was
time to start.
Time to start.
Simple as that.
Yes. And of course, it was, in Boris's time, the note that Boris hummed was extremely difficult.
Indeterminate.
To take. Sometimes the boy almost looked at him again and said, could you sing it again?
There's a lot to be said for the fearlessness of youth. One outstanding musician who took to the challenge brilliantly was chorister Roy Goodman. He was very much the solo boy in my time. Nothing seemed to intimidate him. And at the organ was a young man who went on to have his nerves tested all over the world, conductor Andrew Davis. Roy first.
We had microphones around a lot of the time, and you've got to remember that we made LP recordings at least 2 or 3 times a year. There would be choral evensong recordings. There was the Ash Wednesday service, which was recorded, every year by the BBC. Obviously Christmas, sometimes Easter, and other times. So the aspect of seeing a red light on and there being microphones was nothing unusual. It just meant that you knew you couldn't do anything wrong when that red light was on. When recording was happening, everything had to be both perfect and magic, and you made sure that it was.
First of all, the place was always absolutely jam-packed in a way that it seldom was at any other time. So you would walk with your slightly clattering heels through and up into the organ loft, and of course play some music before, which of course is not ever heard on the air. But yes, it was scary. And when one is 19, 20, 21 years old, the fact that that this this is being heard all over the world is somewhat daunting.
Music by a man whose influence will always remain on the service. David Wilcox was Director of Music in my 3 years at King's. Philip Ledger took over in 1974.
I'd begun as Director of Music in January, so I'd had a whole year to settle in, and I think I realised that the Christmas Eve carol service was very, very special. It was going out to millions of people all over the world. On the other hand, it was just another service as far as the preparation was concerned. I used to take all the choristers into King's Chapel the night before Christmas Eve and ask them one by one to sing Once in Royal David City. And I would say to them, I'm not going to tell you who's going to sing it tomorrow. It might be any one of you. And I really didn't tell them. We would process to the west side of the organ screen, and we would assemble, and just before the red light went on, I'd beckon to one of the boys, and on one year, 2 stepped forward. So I had to say, no, you go back. It's you, very quietly, of course, so that it didn't go into the microphone. But there was all the fun of the preparation, and the chorister who read the lesson too. I mean, I used to think in many ways that at the service, the chorister read best of all. He had that terrific drama in his voice, and he would say, "Who told thee that thou wast naked?" And I thought that this was terrific, really. So I had to prepare the chorister to sing Once in Royal. I had to prepare the boy to read, and the choir we prepared really the whole year.
You know, the worst thing that would, happen would be that the organ might be slightly out of time with the choir, or the congregation would be lagging far behind in one of the carols, or if somebody, tripped on the step up to the lectern or something like that. It was really very mundane things that seemed to go wrong. So I think it was very rare. Maybe something will come to me after we've finished, but I can't think of any real catastrophes.
BBC. Where we're just about to go live to the chapel of King's College, Cambridge, for a festival of 9 lessons and carols. The festival was first held on Christmas.
Thanks to the World Service, King's has become a byword for Christmas right around the globe. But at the end of the 70s, the story of the festival took another turn. And that was all down to one man, a man whose passion for it made him want it to be part of every American's Christmas. His name was Nicholas Nash.
In 1971, I made my first ever trip to the United Kingdom, and I visited Cambridge, went to King's, did not go to Evensong. I'm sorry to make that confession, but it's true. And a year or two later, on Christmas Eve, I picked up the phone to ring my parents, who had retired from Minnesota to another part of the country, and my father answered the phone, and he had obviously been crying. And I said, What's the matter? It's Christmas Eve. Why are you so upset?" He said, "Oh, I'm not upset. I've just been listening to this recording." And I said, "What recording is that?" He said, "It's the recording of a festival of lessons and carols by the choir of King's College at Cambridge." And I said, "Fine, but why are you crying?" And he said, "Because it is the innocence in the boys' voices that moves me." That stuck in my head somehow, and I did get the recording of what turned out to be the 1968 service under David Wilcox's leadership, and listened to it. And then I did a complete right turn and went from a career in education to public radio, as we call it in the United States, our version of the BBC, but smaller. And I thought, with the satellite era arriving, we needed to find a way to understand and work with broadcasters from other parts of the world. Let's see, who comes to mind? Oh yeah, the BBC. And I thought, well, we should find a way to do something with the BBC so we can learn from them. And wait a minute, there's this Christmas Eve thing. So rather blithely, I picked up the phone and called the BBC in London and got put through to a man named John Haslam in Outside Broadcasts and said, "Could we do that in the United States, please?" And he said, "Well, I don't see why not." And so the adventure began actually in 1978, but it took us until 1979 to put all the pieces together.
We welcome you to King's College Chapel in Cambridge, England, for a festival of 9 lessons and carols. I'm Michael Barone, Our program is presented by American Public Media in collaboration with the BBC. And you can find a complete...
As I walked around the building we were in at the time at Minnesota Public Radio, I could feel the vibration of the saws taking me down off the limb I had gone out on. And in the middle of the night before the first broadcast, I sat up in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning saying, I think I've calculated the time zone differences incorrectly. And I now it's December 23rd or early December 24th in Minnesota. It's cold. I ended up in my nightshirt in the garage, or garage as you would say, and I looked around and found an economist's diary with a world time zone map on it and looked and saw that I had calculated the time differences correctly, and I went back to bed, sort of. And the morning, the waiting for the signal to come in from Cambridge was, I think, the same kinds of feelings that an expectant father would have in the waiting room at a hospital.
It's thanks to those NPR broadcasts that the King's Carols have become something of a brand. The choir tours regularly in the States these days, and for Nick Nash, the circle became complete when he managed to get a seat here in the chapel at King's for the service. When he got here, well, it wasn't quite what he expected.
I had been writing the script blind. I had, for several years, I had the choir entering through the west door, which was totally inaccurate, and there were a few other things I'd got wrong, but no one ever wrote and said, oh, come on, they don't do it this way. Anyway, I was waiting for the service to begin with everybody else. We had our overcoats on because it's cool in the chapel in December, and I thought, I'm just going to melt into little pieces when the trouble begins once in Royal David City, and so I have to concentrate on something. And I found a man across the aisle who was wearing a gray herringbone overcoat, and he looked like he was a retired military man, and I thought, good, I'm going to concentrate on him. And by putting my focus on him, I am going to be just fine. I'm going to get through this. It'll be a piece of cake. So the choir arrives. We all stand. I am looking at this man in the gray overcoat, and the trouble begins once in Royal David City. And I think, okay, I'm gonna make it. And then I see this great tear come down this man's face. Well, my heaven! And I think there were lots of tears. Geez, I'm moved just telling about this.
There's something really wonderful about being right here in the chapel itself for this very special service. My own memories are of a sort of warm glow that surrounds the unfolding of the Christmas story through all those wonderful words and music. And then there's the rapt attention of the congregation and a very real sense of occasion. But there's one more special element, and it's one which, well, perhaps provides that extra bit of elusive magic. It's the sound of this glorious building itself.
Your voice just disappears in a magical way. And so when you come to the end of Hark the Herald and the organ cuts off, it just rings around. It's magical.
The chapel, in a way, is in control. It won't let you sing short, jabbed notes at all. If you try and sing loud staccato, it doesn't like it. If you try and sing really loud, it doesn't like it much. What it loves is if you sing really softly, and really softly and rhythmically. Quite a lot of choirs and orchestras slow down for a pianissimo. I always think that the most wonderful effect is a beautiful pianissimo, but really kept rhythmically taut. And King's Chapel tells you whether it likes it or not.
A child is born in Bethlehem. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. And joy is in Jerusalem. Alleluia.
I own, I say somewhat facetiously to people, I own 2 buildings. I own my home in suburban St. Paul, Minnesota, and I own the chapel. And so every time I visit, I go down the central aisle and turn to make sure that that piece of 16th century stained glass of Jesus ascending, and all you see is a bare foot against a cerulean blue sky. And I feel as though I'm home.
And when you think of the people who want to come year on year on year, you'd think, well, if you've done it once, you've done it. But it is something about this vitality that comes with it, that people are drawn back not only to the message, but to this particular method of making the message known.
All we can do is just give thanks, but in a very typically English, reserved way, until you get to the last verse of maybe the last 2 hymns, when you can just let rip. It's the only way you can just give back to the chapel what was given to you. It's a funny thing, and there's a bereavement when you leave it. When the final hymn is over, you go down, but that's fine, because you've experienced something utterly unique.
The fact that it is so relatively unchanged over all these years, that's the constant, and that, I think, is what brings people back, particularly those people outside this country who don't have other reasons for the magic, as you and I do, because of the magic of the chapel, the acoustics, the candles, but who in some far-flung place just say, this is Christmas, and this is part of my Christmas.
And that was the voice of Michael Mates, MP, ending Brian Kay's exploration of Christmas past and Christmas present at King's, which was produced in Cardiff by Michael Sackham.